Okay, let's get started. First of all, can I welcome all of you to Russi this evening, and thank you for coming to this event. It's the third in a series of Westminster Faith Debates, which has been organised by Professor Linda Woodhead, who's sitting on my right, myself and Rebecca Catto from the University of Lancaster, to engage on the Religion and Society research programme funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Economic and Social Research Council, to whom a great deal of thanks are due, who over the last 5 years have been funding a significant amount of research about the place of religion in society. As we come to the end of this research programme, the decision was taken to try and get a much more substantial engagement about the results of this research with people involved in the issues concerned. I personally have been absolutely delighted to be associated with this programme because in my own career in politics and public life, I came to the appreciation that the role of faith in society and of religions is insufficiently understood, insufficiently discussed, insufficiently considered when decisions are being taken in a wide variety of areas in public life. And I strongly support the aspiration of this research programme to get informed discussion about the place of religion in our national life to a much higher level. That's what our events have been about so far. Last week we had education, for example. When I was Secretary of State, there were a whole series of issues around education which were illuminated by the research which has been done. But here in this area, radicalisation is an area absolutely close to my heart because as Home Secretary, I was involved particularly as a result of the 7/7 attacks in a wide set of debates about how the state and how society as a whole should deal with the place of religion in society and deal with the threats that we faced. There were very hard debates in Parliament and elsewhere about the way in which we should be dealing with the challenges and threats that we faced, and concerns that if we did it wrongly, that we'd end up with a state of affairs that significant communities were alienated by the approach that we'd followed, or if we didn't do it adequately, that we wouldn't identify threats that came. And these debates ran in Parliament very strongly indeed. I don't think any government has really got it right fully so far, but I'm absolutely delighted that we'll have research being presented this evening which comments on how that has gone, and we'll be able to have very authoritative response from people who've thought about those issues, and I'm really delighted that's happening. The structure of the evening is going to be that in a minute Professor Linda Woodhead, who's the professor at Lancaster University and directs the whole programme, will introduce each of the three professors who've done the research. There will then be a response from Ed Husain and Mehdi Hasan, who are on my left, to the research which has been established. Everybody is being asked to speak for 10 minutes, and I've got a vicious set of traffic light signals to wave at the appropriate time to anybody who doesn't accept discipline in this regard. And we hope then there'll be a very lively discussion from you in the floor, raising points and asking questions following upon that. We intend to finish at 7 o'clock, after which there'll be drinks available for people to be able to meet and talk to everybody concerned in a positive way. Before introducing Linda, I just want to give some thanks for making this event happen. Firstly, to the two research councils, the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Economic and Social Research Council, whose funding has been absolutely central. Secondly, to the Politics, Philosophy and Religion Department of Lancaster University, where Linda is a professor, as I say, and her two colleagues in particular, Rebecca Catto and Peter Ainsworth, who've been absolutely central in making the organisation of this happen in an effective way. Thirdly, to the Theos Foundation and to Elizabeth Hunter, who's been working closely with us and has been able to play a very important and effective role in developing our dialogues. To the Coexist Foundation, who are providing funding for some of our activities. And finally, I'm instructed by Elizabeth to say that for those of you who are interested in twittering, I know that will be almost everybody in the room, the hash code is #WFD12, and if you Twitter, you can engage on that process. Now, it's been a great privilege of mine to work with Linda during the time I've been visiting Professor of Politics and Faith at the University of Lancaster, and I'm delighted to introduce her. She's a preeminent scholar in her field. She's directed the whole programme, and her energy and drive has made this happen. So, Linda, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you today.
Thank you very much indeed, Charles. Well, this Religion and Society programme that Charles keeps talking about and that I direct it's a cluster of research projects funded by a £12 million investment by the research councils. And it began in 2007, and so it was really coincident with the July the 7th bombings. And so we had to think quite hard about how to respond to that event in research terms. And we did three things. One was to fund some of the high-quality research bids on that area, and you're going to hear a bit about that. We also funded a collaboration with colleagues in Russia and the Caucasus, looking at radicalisation there, and we had a dialogue between scholars looking at the UK situation and looking at that situation, and Marat has been important in that, and that has resulted in a collection of the research and the papers. You've got a copy to wave around, Marat, and we've got some copies of these available today, so if you've got a particular interest in that issue, come and see Marat or I, and we'll try and make sure that we get you one of those. And finally, and really most importantly, the Religion and Society programme has sponsored a semi-autonomous website which is called radicalizationresearch.org. That's one word, and I do encourage you to have a look at that. Radicalizationresearch.org. We've got both the American and the UK spellings, and you can find that online right now. Matthew Francis, who's speaking tonight, has been important in that, and so have all our speakers, actually. And the idea of that was that we didn't just want to commission more new research. There was an awful lot of research going on, and it's just exploded, of course, in the period since we started. And the idea of our website is to consolidate that. It's to make the best academic research easily available. There are short summaries of a lot of the research, and there are commissioned essays by leading scholars which will summarise a whole area of the research. So it's another way of getting good research into the bloodstream. Well, tonight gives us a chance, on the basis of these various initiatives, to stand back a little bit and say, what have we learnt from this explosion of research about the topic? And let me make just two brief comments before handing over to the speakers who will tell you about that, answer that question. The first thing just to note is that this is a topic which has its own word, radicalisation. And in a way, I think you can place research and researchers somewhere along a spectrum between those who think that that's a good and appropriate thing, that there is this special word, and those who think that's a rather unhelpful thing. And the first camp like having their own word because they believe that we are dealing with something that is radically new and distinct, perhaps discrete. The second camp dislike the word because they think it obscures its continuity with other phenomena. It obscures the fact that it's just a type of terrorism, or that we know things about new religious movements already that we should be taking account of, or whatever. So in the first case is about exceptionalizing the phenomenon. The second case, there are lots of people who are trying to de-exceptionalize the phenomenon and say, we already know quite a lot about that, let's learn from it. And I think actually most of our researchers tonight fall more into that second de-exceptionalizing camp, but you can make up your minds. My second point is that there's another reason why the term radicalization is controversial, and that's because it casts the net very wide. It suggests that the holding of radical beliefs is itself dangerous and a cause for state concern. And that's been manifest in the Prevent part of the UK government's approach to dealing with radicalisation. And as you'll hear, again, I think the consensus from our speakers on this side, the researchers tonight, is that the breadth, the lack of focus in Prevent has been costly and perhaps even dangerous. Costly, I mean literally financially costly, because there are all sorts of initiatives going on at the moment that they consider of dubious benefit. I was just talking to Matthew about his observation of a recent event called RAP, workshop for raising awareness of Prevent, where everyone sat around in a group and watched a little clip from This Is England of people sitting in a council flat chatting, and were told that this was an example of radicalisation, and then to discuss the implications of this. And Matthew's follow-up research with the participants in that ordinary workshop somewhere in Britain was that the result was that everyone was left completely confused what the phenomenon was. So this is literally costly and seems to be perhaps doing more harm than good. And that leads to the perhaps not just costly but dangerous point, because in fact some of these counter-radicalisation moves may actually alienate large parts of the Muslim community. And as I think Marat's paper suggests tonight, it can actually lead to an us and them mentality and even produce the effects it's meant to stop. So a broader point, if we're thinking not just about what causes radicalisation, but about how to deal with it, is there seems to be a tension, as Charles just put it rather nicely, between averting potential terrorist threats and alienating broader communities. And I think one of the things we're going to hear tonight is that the research suggests that we still haven't got that balance quite right, and that any counter-terrorism strategy needs to undertake some kind of serious cost-benefit analysis which balances dealing with the very real and very serious threat of terrorism and taking account of the cost to some of the most vulnerable and innocent members of our society. So I'm going to hand over first to Professor Mark Sedgwick, who is Professor of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Aarhus in Denmark. Mark.
Thank you. And thank you for asking me to be here this evening. Until 2007, I was living and teaching in Cairo and researching the history of terrorism. In 2007, I moved back to Europe, and since then, I've been researching not so much radicalization as policies designed to prevent it, and especially the assumptions on which these are based. One problem that struck me immediately was that there was absolutely no consensus on what radicalization actually was, and not even on what radical means. This may sound like a tiresome academic quibble. After all, it could be replied, we all know what's radical when we see it. But actually it isn't like that, as different people very clearly regard different things as radical. And this is a problem, as if we don't even know what it is that we're trying to counter, we're unlikely to be very successful in countering it. And we may, as Linda said, even make things worse by trying to counter what it is counterproductive to counter. Understandings of radicalism vary a lot from country to country. Some countries define radicalism or extremism, and these two words are generally used interchangeably, rather narrowly, in terms of supporting the use of violence. Other countries define it much more widely, sometimes even in terms that include intolerance within radicalism. And the current British Prevent strategy defines extremism as including vocal or active opposition to mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs, unquote. We all agree that intolerance is generally a bad thing. And it's also the case that a truly tolerant person could probably not be a terrorist. But intolerance is unfortunately a rather widespread phenomenon and hard to counter. One reason for this range of different definitions is that understandings of radicalism tend to expand. There are, I think, three main reasons for this. One of them is the absence of any precise definition of the term. There is no bottom line that can easily be referred to. A second reason is that once resources are available for counter-radicalization, People who wish to make use of those resources have an obvious interest in portraying whatever they're opposing or proposing to oppose as radical. A third and related reason is that when counter-radicalization tasks are given to people who are already engaged in some other form of socially useful activity, they tend to incorporate counter-radicalization into whatever it is that they're doing already. In one European country, not Britain, counter-radicalization has even expanded to include campaigns against playground bullying and in favor of celebrating Constitution Day. These campaigns may well have been valuable in and of themselves, but have contributed little to the ultimate objective of combating terrorism. If part of the problem is the absence of any precise definition of radicalism, it might be argued that what is needed is a precise definition. It's likely, however, that the term is actually incapable of precise definition, since it indicates a degree of something, but not what that something is. What is needed is further understanding of that something. I'll start with two extreme positions, which are not problematic. What is problematic is the ground between them. At one extreme, everyone's agreed that there are certain activities that are not actually terrorism, but are so close to it that they do need to be stopped, such, for example, as running a jihadist website. At the other extreme, it's clear that terrorism always takes place against a background of attitudes without which it could not occur. It's easier to identify the relevant background in retrospect, which is what I did when I was working on the history of terrorism. The anarchist terrorism at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, for example, could not possibly have occurred without there being an anarchist movement in the first place. And the anarchist movement was part of socialism. No socialism, no anarchism. No anarchist terrorism, and no Labour Party either, of course. Just as everyone's agreed that certain activities are threats that must be stopped, so most people who've studied the history of terrorism would agree that even though socialism in 1900 was both radical in the terms of that time and also a cause of terrorism, the answer was not to try to counter the development of socialism, though some governments did try that and of course failed, as it was simply too big a target, too big a trend. The problem then is where to draw the line between these two extremes. What sort of activities and attitudes need to be countered, and what can be countered? This seems to me to be a better question to ask than how do we define radicalism. Something that struck me in 2007, when I came back to Europe from Cairo, was that many of the political and religious views that were regarded as radical in Europe were views that I encountered routinely in Cairo. It was generally accepted by most Egyptians, for example, that there was a clash of civilizations going on between Islam and the West. Strict Saudi-inspired interpretations of Islam, of the variety that are now generally called Salafism, were also quite normal. The narrative of the clash of civilizations is central to the milieu from which jihadist terrorism derives, and the milieu in which it finds its support. It's today's equivalent of the socialism from which anarchist terrorism once derived. It's also a narrative that, in modified form, can inspire other sorts of terrorism, as anyone who read the manifesto of Anders Behring Breivik will have seen. However, that narrative on its own is not enough to produce terrorism. Only a tiny percentage of the millions of Egyptians who accept this narrative have even thought for a minute that they personally should take some active part in the clash that they think is going on, and even fewer have actually done so. The blogs that promote the mirror version of the clash narrative that Breivik accepted attract a lot of traffic. But once again, there have only been a handful of cases of people actually acting on the basis of this narrative. Similarly, Salafi interpretations of Islam are also central to the milieu from which jihadist terrorism derives. But only a tiny percentage of Salafis actually become involved in terrorism, and when they do, this probably has more to do with the acceptance of the clash of civilizations narrative and with personal factors than it does with Salafism. The problem is not the narrative or the Salafism, then, but the people who accept and promote the idea that violence is the proper response to the narrative. This is the something that needs to be countered. Attempts to counter the clash of civilizations narrative or the rise of Salafism are not only doomed to failure, but, as Dr. Shterin will demonstrate, risk proving counterproductive, and not only when the means used are as dramatic as some of those he will tell us about this evening. Counter-radicalization efforts in one European country, again not Britain, targeted a Salafi mosque using a range of means from parking restrictions to fire regulations to discourage attendance there. If I were a Salafi attending that mosque, these measures would have convinced me of that government's hostility to Islam, and so of the truth of the clash of civilizations narrative. I've almost run out of time, so in closing, I'll just say that what we need is more focus on precisely what it is that we are trying to counter. We need to recognize that the views and associated activities from which terrorism might arise are widespread, and that it's neither possible nor even desirable to eliminate them. Yes, keep a watchful eye on the relevant milieus, by all means, but discreetly. We need to recognize that eliminating non-violent expressions of certain political, religious, and ideological positions may actually make violent expression of those positions more likely, not less likely. In short, what we need to counter is the violence.
Thanks very much, Mark. And now over to Dr. Matthew Francis, who's done his doctoral research on this topic. As I've said, he is responsible for maintaining the radicalizationresearch.org website, and is also currently Programme Manager of the Religious Literacy Leadership Programme at Goldsmiths. Matthew.
Thank you, Linda. As Linda has already mentioned, I'm the editor of the website radicalizationresearch.org, which is funded by the Religion and Society Programme and which brings high-quality research on the subject of radicalisation to the attention of people working in the media and policy arenas. My own research has also been on religion and violence. As such, I have read hundreds of books and articles on the subject, and my objective tonight is to bring to you, or to present to you, what seem to me to be the main areas in which some significant contributions have been made about the causes of violent extremism. I'm going to leave it to my fellow speakers to speak about why radicalisation is such a contested concept, and Mark has already done that. However, nobody thinks or acts in a vacuum, and whilst radicalisation is an imperfect label, it is one that currently guides policy and research on radical and violent actions. And it is to these factors, or to the factors affecting these, that I wish to pay attention. I will also explain why, even if we do decide to adopt the language of radicalisation, that we should not imagine that it has some special connection to religion. Looking then at what existing research tells us about what causes violent radical actions, 4 areas emerge as particularly significant. They can be labelled situational, strategic, ideological, and individual. Starting with situational factors, these may further be broken down into enabling and motivating preconditions of terrorist violence. Of the enabling preconditions, the most discussed is the nature of the modern world itself. Such things as mass transit, urbanization, and electronic means of communication provide means for radical ideas to be shared, reinforced, and rendered plausible to potentially large numbers of people. Obviously, the existence of enabling conditions does not entail that everyone using them will be radicalized, and that's a caveat for all that follows. But their presence can carve particular pathways for contemporary terrorism. Enabling factors only become potent, however, when combined with motivating ones. Factors like poverty, for example, or the sense of being excluded from the full benefits of modern affluence are widely recognized to be amongst possible causes of radical behavior. What seems to count most is a gap between a sense of entitlement and actual possibilities of achievement, which helps explain why the experiences of discrimination and social segregation encountered by middle-class educated persons are also seen to play a role in radicalization. Finally, in relation to situational factors, we need to consider the actual precipitants or triggers. These are the flashpoints which push some people into thinking that violence is the appropriate response. An example of such a trigger might be foreign policy supporting wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or the failure of Western powers to resolve the Palestinian situation. This third situational factor has been questioned, for example, by Mark, who shows that political dissent is an extremely poor indicator of potential violent extremism. These criticisms aside, however, the idea that there are particular triggers to action is perhaps the most discussed and the easiest to comprehend of the potential causes of radicalization. But it is much too easy to give apparent triggers too much prominence in leading to the actions which follow. Moving from the situational to the strategic factors causing violence, the literature reminds us that terrorists do not act randomly or merely emotionally in relation to some trigger, but act rationally in the pursuit of strategic aims. A distinction can be drawn between long-term and short-term strategic aims. In the case of Al-Qaeda, for example, both short and long-term aims are violent. In the short term, actions such as 9/11 sought to motivate sympathizers, whilst also striking terror into their enemy. In the longer term, they sought to end the perceived universal imposition of Western values on the world. Next, we have ideological factors. These can briefly be defined as non-negotiable beliefs about what is good for society. In my own work, for this is where my own research is focused, I refer to them as beliefs about what is sacred. What is sacred can be violated, and when it is natural to wish to defend it. Some people resort to violent means in order to do so. My own approach is to code the statements of religious and non-religious groups into a set of markers that outline their non-negotiable beliefs. Secular groups, such as the Red Army faction, for example, could be seen to have sacred beliefs, which they defended with violence as much as religious groups like Aum Shinrikyo or Al-Qaeda. Closer to home, the sacred was directly invoked in the debate around the Rushdie affair, both by the religious defenders of Muhammad and the secular defenders of free speech. Groups are bound together by such commitments, and when they feel the need to defend them, they, or individuals within them, may resort to violence. Still, and even assuming that all of the above may have led to an individual being involved in a group with violent strategic aims, and which feels that what it holds sacred has been violated, it is still not the case that an individual member of such a group will act violently. For example, Anthony Garcia, who was convicted for his part in the 2004 fertilizer bomb plot, and his older brother were both members of the same radical Islamic group. Yet while his older brother was apparently the more deeply committed to the group's ideology, only Anthony acted violently. Economic background, relative assimilation into host cultures, apparent ideological background, and other seemingly important factors all, at the end of the day, fail to account for why some people act violently and others do not. The individual factors constantly emerge as unpredictable elements which foil any attempt to predict who will resort to violence, and which foil the attempts of so-called theories of radicalization to accurately account for violent behavior, other than in retrospect. And so I leave you with 3 points. First, while radical actions are often about defending sacred beliefs, it is as valid to talk about the secular sacred as it is about what is religiously sacred, and the defense of either can lead to violent actions. Second, there is a growing consensus among scholars that there is in fact no conveyor belt into radicalization, and no theory that can predict exactly when and where it will occur. Third, What this also explains is why a lot of the best research that contributes to this field is not produced by so-called radicalization experts, but by scholars working across various fields, including sociologists, historians, political scientists, scholars of religion, and so on, all of whom can bring an expertise in their field to aid in the understanding of the multifactorial phenomenon, which at the moment many people choose to refer to as radicalization.
Thanks very much, Matthew. And our final research presentation is by Dr. Marat Shterin, who is lecturer in Sociology of Religion at King's College here in London. Marat.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, my colleagues, and thank you to all of you. Let me start from making a general point, which is actually not in my paper, but I think it could be a useful reminder that throughout history, people have addressed their aspirations and grievances by establishing new religious movements that challenge the existing authorities and unashamedly, unexpectedly, in many unexpected ways involved in politics. And the founders of all major religions were actually rebels of their times that challenged the existing authorities, as well as major religions legitimize the existing order. I think it's a useful reminder. So I would like to make a general point that we can make a great deal. It makes a great deal of sense to draw on the wealth of research produced by scholars of new religions to understand the current situation, in particular the new Islamic movements. I would like to make three major points with respect to this research. First of all, the new Islamic beliefs can find appeal among some predominantly young people, not only because they're Islamic, but also because they are new and provide a basis for creating alternative space for social experimentation and efforts at social change. Second, tensions are likely to occur as a result of it, as has always been the case with new religions, because an establishment of any new religion is also a kind of creating of a new us versus the existing them divide, or it can be the other way around, depending on how you look at it. We should approach these tensions and even conflicts associated with them as an interactive rather than one-way process in which the wider society is a party. And thirdly, I would argue in strongest possible terms that while a connection between these tensions and the wider society and violence can be discovered, it should not be assumed to apply wherever such tensions are found. Now, let me illustrate this by telling you a story based on my research. It has a personal stake for me because I met the leader of the movement I'm going to talk about, Anzor Astemirov, briefly in the 1980s at a conference in Moscow. He was a shy and articulate, well-mannered scholar of Islam. He was very passionate about establishing a new Islamic institute in his native small republic of Kabardino-Balkaria in the northern Caucasus. Within the following decade or so, he established this new movement, the New Muslims, and engaged in violence against law enforcement agencies and ended up as Amir Saifullah of the Caucasian Emirate, an Islamic state that operates mainly on the internet and a network of terrorist cells. So it looks like a perfect example of radicalization. But I'm quite reluctant to use this concept precisely because of the tendency to simplify a number of complex processes which are actually involved in this connection between adopting particular beliefs, in this case, new Islamic beliefs, and violence. And let me now sort of to show what sort of dynamics briefly were behind this behind this drive. to violence. You can find the details in the special issue of Religion, State and Society, which gives you sort of fuller picture of what actually happened. So the new Muslims started to appear in the early 90s and came predominantly from the post-Soviet generation in a region which was beset by a near-collapsing economy, suffering from the repercussions of armed conflicts in neighboring Chechnya and tensions elsewhere in the northern Caucasus. However, compared to non-members, the new Muslims tended to be better educated and aspiring and take advantage of the new social, economic, and political freedoms of the post-Soviet 1990s. And yet, in that region, they were shackled by the clan-based and highly restrictive social relationships. Bribery was ubiquitous, tight subordination within society, in particular of younger people to older people. And the existing Islamic institutions in the region had little appeal for the young. Communities of the new Muslims, on the other hand, the Jamaats, provided a range of opportunities for these young people. In business, all members were employed in social status, holding positions of responsibility, for example. And generally speaking, what was new about these people, what created an alternative source of authority for the group was Salafi beliefs. And in an apparent paradox, these beliefs, which were based on the idea of sort of returning back to the region of Islam, created a basis for modernizing social relationships in that particular region. I already described the kind of practices that these communities offered. Then the tensions. Tensions inevitably occurred in that region precisely, and it almost always happens with this type of new religions. Because they challenged the established community relationships, the established beliefs of their parents and grandparents and so on. However, these tensions didn't have to spill over into violence. Indeed, the leadership of the group went into great lengths to oppose the most extreme expressions of Salafi beliefs, for example, Takfiri ideas about indiscriminate violence against the infidel. Demographic changes were also doing their work. The new Muslims were growing older, many of them were getting families and accepting all the responsibilities that came with it. Now, where the violence came from, what led this largely peaceful reformist movement to become violent? To analyze that, I use the models that are very well known in the study of new religious movements and I find very helpful. What is important about these models? That they encourage us to reflect on how actions by both new groups and their opponents, including state agencies, can contribute to either escalating or aborting a spiral of violence. In other words, seeing violence as an interactive process. What was important in this particular case is that both sides were framing each other in highly hostile form as false Muslims. However, even this framing didn't have to spill over into violence had not the labels applied to the new Muslims, like Salafi or Wahhabi or Islamist, not been associated with violence in the region where terrorist groups had already been operating and attempting to co-opt new Muslims into their ranks. It's quite an important dimension of that situation because obviously we deal with these tensions and conflicts in different contexts, and the context is important. As a result, indiscriminate violence started to be used by law enforcement agencies to curb the movement, and it included torture, imprisonment without trial, desecration, and closure of mosques. The local terrorist groups and Chechen rebels used this further to pressure the new Muslims to join in pan-Caucasian jihad against the Russian infidel as the common enemy. In turn, the law enforcement agencies responded with ever-escalating violence, driving the movement's leadership ever closer to joining the terrorist jihadists. And so it happened that some new Muslims became both victims and perpetrators of violence. Obviously, it happened in a different context, but we can learn a number of lessons from that situation. First of all, in terms of the appeal of new religious beliefs, I find quite similar dynamics in the British context, and Italy as well, with research, including within the Regional Society program done by Laura MacDonald, Lucy Michael, and in Denmark by Lena Kuller. And also another dimension with it that, as is the case with other new religions, such as experimentation starts to be viewed with particular concern when it proposes more radical challenges to mainstream values, conventions, and politics. What we can learn from this is that overreaction or a particular type of reaction to a new to these groups which operate within the law and are generally peaceful might produce the outcome which is contrary to what is desired. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you'll all agree with me. We've had three absolutely excellent presentations from the three researchers, which have been both interesting and clear and very clearly put to help this discussion. To take us forward, we've got two very distinguished activists and commentators to respond to this research, also working on the same time rules of 10 minutes each. The first is Mehdi Hasan. Mehdi is a distinguished political journalist in Britain. He's political editor of the New Statesman. After doing his degree at Oxford, he went into broadcast media, BBC, Channel 4 Current Affairs, a range of different things. He appears on The Big Question on Sundays from time to time. Just a small advertisement, Linda is on The Big Question this Sunday, and I recommend looking at it on some of these issues. He's done a very courageous thing, Mehdi, in my opinion, which is that jointly with Don McIntyre, he's written a biography of Ed Miliband, and we'll see how that runs.
James, Don's son.
Sorry, I beg your pardon, James McIntyre, Don's son, I apologise. Mehdi's a very distinguished journalist, and we're delighted you're here, Mehdi, and look forward to your response to these pieces of research.
Thank you very much, Charles, for your kind words. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to be here at the third of these Westminster Faith Debates, especially this particular one on radicalisation and extremism. What's so important, I think, and positive about today's debate and discussion and the presentations we've just heard is how well informed our three panelists are. As a journalist and someone who was working at a 24-hour news channel on 7/7, I can tell you that there are a lot of self-appointed terror experts around these days who sadly lack the essential quality of actual expertise. The terrorism industry, so-called, has been booming since 9/11. It's been also responsible for pumping out a lot of misinformation, crude stereotypes, false analogies, and basically knee-jerk prejudices about religion, Islam, and Muslims. So tonight I want to make three brief points. The first is that I don't personally believe or agree with the rather simplistic, if fashionable, view that says religion is the cause or key driver of radicalization. And I believe much of the commentary that tries to link increased religiosity to extremism or radicalization or terrorism misses the wood from the trees. Just to give one example, my favorite example, back in June 2004, at the 12th and final public hearing of the 9/11 Commission in the United States, a phalanx of law enforcement and intelligence officials from the US government arrived to give their testimony. And Lee Hamilton, the vice chair of the commission, a former Democratic congressman, he asked them, he said, you've looked at and examined the lives of these people as closely as anybody. What have you found out about why these men did what they did? What motivated them to do it? The answers to these questions were provided by Supervisory Special Agent James Fitzgerald of the FBI, who had led the 9/11 investigation for the agency. He said, I believe they feel a sense of outrage against the United States. They identify with the Palestinian problem. They identify with people who oppose oppressive regimes. And I believe they tend to focus their anger on the United States. No mention of religion, no mention of Islam, no mention of virgins in heaven, 72 or otherwise. For the lead investigators from the US government into the 9/11 attacks, politics, not faith, was the key motivating factor. That's not to say that religion wasn't or isn't a contributing factor to radicalization, to the radicalization of young Muslim men specifically. but it's one of many, and it's never been the main one. Sadly, Fitzgerald's testimony was not included in the final 9/11 Commission report, but in recent years there have been a multitude of intelligence reports, official government inquiries, academic studies, which support this rather obvious, if unfashionable, view that the root causes of radicalization, of extremism, of terrorism are more political than theological, more worldly than next worldly. One of the most famous of these is the book Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, in which US political scientist Robert Pape examined all the known suicide terror attacks between 1980 and 2005, 315 in total. And he concluded, quote, "There is little connection between suicide terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism or any of the world's religions. Rather, what nearly all suicide terrorist attacks have in common is a specific secular and strategic goal to compel modern democracies to withdraw military forces from territory that the terrorists consider their homeland." It's a point Matthew touched on earlier in his presentation, talking about strategic and rational aims. This leads me to my second point. If there was a clear-cut, clearly delineated link, a causal connection between religion, between faith, specifically Islam, and radicalization, extremism, terrorism, then why are there so few Muslim terrorists around? Why are there so few? You might think, what do you mean few? Well, it's a question that Professor Charles Kurtzman asks in his recent book, The Missing Martyrs. He points out how 99.9% of the world's billion or so Muslims have consistently and repeatedly rejected the terrorist call to take up arms against the infidel, against the crusaders. They've refused to read the Quran in the same way that, say, bin Laden has read the Quran. Out of more than 150,000 murders in the United States since 9/11, he points out that Islamist terrorists have accounted for fewer than 3 dozen deaths. Fewer than 200 Muslim Americans have been caught up in terror plots. He says the credit has to go for the low level of violence to the millions of Muslims who have refrained from answering the call to terrorism. It's a point Mark echoed in his presentation as well, distinguishing between those who may look or sound radical in their views or beliefs and those who take radical terrorist violent actions. The point about radicalization of the religious or supposedly Islamic variety is that contrary to the popular media narrative, there isn't much of it around, not when you step back and look at the big picture. And that leads me to my third and final point, which relates, I think personally, to the most important statement that was made today in the presentations by Matthew, that, quote, "There is a growing consensus amongst scholars that there is in fact no conveyor belt into radicalization, no theory that can predict exactly when or where it will occur." Exactly. And why is it such an important statement? Because we have a government, a conservative-led, centre-right coalition government, which has based its entire counter-extremism, counter-terrorism strategy on this so-called, and I would argue, mythical conveyor belt. Take David Cameron's awful and simplistic speech in Munich last year, in which he said, and I quote, "As evidence emerges about those convicted of terrorism offences, it is clear that many of them were initially influenced by what some have called non-violent extremists, and then they took those radical beliefs to the next level by embracing violence." Sadly, that isn't the case. Cameron's own civil servants told him in July 2010 in a leaked memo to the Cabinet's Home Affairs Subcommittee, "It is wrong to regard radicalization in this country as a linear conveyor belt moving from grievance through radicalization to violence. This thesis seems to both misread the radicalization process and give undue weight to ideological factors. As Matthew pointed out, individual factors constantly emerge as unpredictable elements which foil any attempt to predict who will resort to violence." And it's the violence that matters. We get lost in this debate about radicalization and we forget that it's the violence that matters. As Mark said, some countries define radicalism narrowly in terms of supporting the use of violence. Other countries define it much more widely, sometimes even in terms that include intolerance within radicalism, including our own government's newly updated prevent strategy. Here in the UK in recent years, in my view, there has been an outrageous raising of the bar between what is called moderate and what is called radical or extremist. In his Munich speech, the Prime Minister talked of equal rights regardless of race, sex or sexuality in his list of non-negotiable British values which help us weed out the extremists within us. To be British is to belong here, to believe in these things, he declared. Yet, as I wrote in The Guardian at the time, will the Haredi Jews of Stamford Hill, North London, be held to the same standards? How about the Conservative Party, which backed the homophobic Section 28 as recently as 2001? As for gender equality, this is a Prime Minister who has just 4 women in his cabinet, only one more than Hamid Karzai's cabinet in Afghanistan. Is Cameron, by his own definition, an extremist? Look, he's not. One of the key points, I think, to emerge from the 3 presentations is that we need to focus on what's important, on what's relevant, on where the threat lies. And so I think Mark's conclusion is indisputable. It really should be uncontroversial. That is, quote, in short, what we need to counter is violence. That's what we should be focused on. And the answer to today's question, what have we learned about radicalization, is a lot, but not enough. We need to know much, much more, especially in terms of identifying those varied, hard-to-pin-down triggers that turn so-called non-violent extremists into violent extremists or terrorists. And crucially, we need to base our opinions and our strategies on facts and figures, on empirical evidence, not on our own ideologies or our knee-jerk prejudices. Otherwise, we just end up falling back, we end up reverting to the discredited, simplistic, self-defeating war on terror narrative that has given us nothing else other than more war and more terror, but very little understanding or insight. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehdi. And our final second respondent is Ed Hussain. Ed's had a very interesting life. He was brought up in the East End of London, in Limehouse, in Tower Hamlets, became involved in so-called Islamic fundamentalist groups, and then took the decision to talk about what had actually gone on in those groups in a very public way. He wrote a very well-known book, The Islamist, which drew attention to these issues in, I think, a very courageous way. He established the Quillam Foundation, which has the purpose of promoting discussion and consideration of these issues. And though he's now moved on from that now and remains on the board of it, it still plays an important role. He's now a senior fellow on the Council for Foreign Relations in New York, and we're really delighted, Ed, that you've taken the trouble to come from New York to join us this evening and give us your insights on this research that we've got. Really delighted that you're here, Ed Hussain.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you everyone else for coming. It'll be, I suppose, no surprise that I may disagree with 1 or 2 people on the panel, not least Mehdi. As we were coming down, I mean, I was rather hoping that Mehdi would be the last speaker, but it just so happens my name is Hussein and his is Hasan, and therefore he goes before me. But he was sharp enough to remind me that Imam Hasan came before Imam Hussein in Muslim history. Now, that said, I'm going to have to differ briefly with Mehdi and some of the others, but I want to just broadly outline what I'm going to say, and hopefully it'll be cramped within 10 minutes, and I'll be as fast as I can. 3 things. Firstly, areas in which I agree with most of the panelists. Secondly, areas in which, for want of a better expression, I'd like to ask questions, if I may, rather than disagree. And thirdly, where is the nature of the problem that we're talking about? But before I do those 3 things, I want to, in the Socratic spirit, define our terms, as it were, and there's been some debate and discussion healthily about the definition of radicalism, and my own working definition thus far has been, and I'm open to correction, I'm not casting anything in stone here, is that it's the process of adopting theopolitical ideas that can lead to violence. So radicalization is the process of adopting theopolitical ideas that can lead to violence. So what's theopolitics? Theopolitics, again, is the intersection where a certain theology, a certain reading of religion informs political ideology. So there is a merger of religion and politics. Now, where I agree with what was said initially is that there is definitely a milieu from within where terrorism and political violence emerges. I completely agree. And I think it's very important to say, secondly, that there are a very, very small number of not just Muslims, but also Salafis or Wahhabis, whatever we wish to call them. I think Salafis is best because that's what they prefer, although other Salafis of the Afghani tradition would object to that it's a very small minority, and therefore targeting Salafism per se isn't necessarily productive, but I agree it's counterproductive. And the third point, much like what Mehdi said, it's a huge relief to be sat here and not be defending Islam and Muslims in the sense that it's scripture that's faulty, that it's the life of the Prophet that's faulty, that it's Muslim history that inspires terrorism, and the 72 virgins question that keeps coming up, especially when I'm speaking at audiences in the US. And what troubles me often is these audiences are powerful audiences who For example, at the U.S. Army War College, where I speak often, and people who are going out to Afghanistan and going out to Iraq and most likely other parts of the Middle East have that mindset that somehow these guys are after 72 virgins. But what's worth noting, I think, as a quick side note, is for those who are takfiri jihadis, they don't need to go to heaven for their 72 virgins. In their interpretation, it's quite kosher to have it all here, because they're at war, and this is Dar al-Harb as it's understood, and in Dar al-Harb, whether it's in Muslim majority countries or here, having access to war booty, i.e. the women of the enemies, isn't necessarily theologically problematic in their view. So those who argue that somehow they're on the road to 72 virgins don't really understand the road on which these people are traveling. But with that side note, I want to come on to my fourth point of agreement, which is completely agree with the new Islamic versus the old Islamic dynamic here, that the movement or the mindset that produces terrorism, though it's a minority mindset, is by and large new, is by and large, postmodern, is by and large post-colonial, and it's not something that we've seen a convincing historic trajectory for. So what is it that one finds somewhat problematic? I mean, I'd say the following. Firstly, there was an illusion that there's a link to poverty here in relation to terrorism. I'm not so sure, because if it was about poverty, then why is it that the poorest, or one of the poorest, Muslim majority nations in the world has the least amount of radicalism in contrast to other countries? And I'm thinking here of Bangladesh. That in contrast, say, to Pakistan, or in contrast, say, to Saudi Arabia, which is a wealthier country, or Kuwait, which is a wealthier country, and the rate of radicalism in Saudi Arabia is higher than, say, in Pakistan, I'm not sure if the poverty connection necessarily is the most convincing one. The 9/11 hijackers were primarily, most of them at least, from Saudi Arabia, most of them wealthy and Western educated, they're not necessarily poor. The 7/7 bombers, again, the poverty argument doesn't apply from where they came from. Omar Sheikh, I think, is the best example. The killer for Daniel Pearl in 2003 came from a very wealthy family, private school, the London School of Economics, and I could go on. So the poverty connection, though it may apply in terms of the foot soldiers in some of the terrorist attacks in countries such as Pakistan, it doesn't necessarily work in terms of trying to explain what it is we're facing here. My second point, and I think perhaps this is a more contentious point in terms of questioning some of the assertions, is this focus that it must always be on violence. Now, I'm not a Tory nor a mad Liberal Democrat, so it's not in my gift to be defending the current government. But what I will say is, once it reaches the stage of violent expression, it's too late. It's far too late. And by then, it's not really your and my business anymore. It's over to the FBI and their equivalent here, the special branch and the police and everyone else. The least we can do is, if we know someone's committed to, at that stage, terrorism, tip off the local authorities, just as we would a murderer or a rapist or a paedophile, because they then become criminals. But it's too late by then. I think there are things that can be done beforehand, but those aren't necessarily initiatives that must be government-led. And I think some of the debate is too state-centric, in that we're dependent on government to take the lead, and we're dependent on government to provide training and everything else, whereas much of this can be civil societal, and I'll come to that in a moment. But just as we don't accept anti-Semitism, if someone attacks verbally Jewish people, we would challenge it. We don't necessarily think it's acceptable. Just as we don't accept homophobia, if someone attacks gay people verbally, we would challenge it, undermine it. Just as we challenge sexism. We don't wait for someone to become a rapist, but if someone's expressing sexist ideas in the public domain, we would challenge it, contain it, undermine it, make it morally repulsive, unacceptable. Why is it that we're prepared to stand by and say, if someone's attacking in certain places what's called a kuffar, derogatory term for non-Muslims, that somehow it's acceptable that we can stand by and say, oh yes, to hell with the kuffar, oh yes, the kuffar are dirty, and the hatred that comes out of some quarters vis-a-vis non-Muslims, that somehow that's acceptable, but other forms aren't. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that government should be constantly involved in this, but my contention is, if we're prepared to challenge other forms of bigotry, intolerance, and hatred, we too should be out there publicly prepared to challenge in a civil society context, in a civilized context, not necessarily spying and handing them over to the authorities, but bigotry wherever it comes. And if that bigotry expresses itself as bigotry towards non-Muslims, that too should be challenged, not tolerated. And I'm not saying there should be legal prescription against it, which there exists incidentally for the other categories I spoke about. Turning then to generally where's the problem, and I'm conscious I've got about 5 minutes, so I'll be as quick as possible. 4 areas are the hub of radicalism in not just Britain, but in many other countries, and some of them are Muslim-majority countries. And at the Q&A, we can go into details. But firstly, prisons. Secondly, university campuses, not all campuses, but about 30 plus in the UK. Thirdly, some mosques, not all mosques, some mosques. And I'm not saying they're all Salafi, they're not. Many mosques aren't Salafi, so let's put the Salafi issue to a side. I don't think it's hugely relevant. And fourth is, and perhaps the most compounding element to this is the internet and the connections that are made on chat rooms and elsewhere. So those are the 4 hubs of extremism and terrorism, or the precursor to terrorism. Now, I know the word ideology gets bandied around and people feel uncomfortable using it, so let's avoid it. But there are 5 ideas that are problematic. There are 5 ideas that are theopolitical that lead to the justification of suicide bombing. And I'm going to go through them one by one, and I'm hoping to be questioned, and I'm prepared to answer them towards the end. And again, I say this is not for state prescription or prescribing aspects of Muslim behavior, and this is not about most Muslims or the vast majority of Muslims either, but it is a collection of theopolitical ideas that are out there and that need challenging. And the first of these is the belief in hakimiyya. Again, it's a modernist belief that it's God's rule that must be hakim, or form the basis of government, that man or parliament is not sovereign. That hakimiyya or khilafah or imama, whatever you want to call it, as understood not by the vast majority of Muslims but by a particular sect of Muslims. And it's their interpretation of, or their way of defending their community that leads to the subsequent problems I will mention. But the first is hakimiyya. The second is the belief in takfir. And takfir here includes this group of people who are not necessarily Wahhabis or Salafis, but by far the most extreme form of Salafis, who are takfiris, who believe in other Muslims. You know, most of us, both of us on this panel certainly, and most of us sitting in this room perhaps, to be non-Muslims. So before the issue reaches you, as it were, non-Muslims in the West, it impacts Muslims themselves, this belief in takfir. Building on this belief in takfir is this vigilante jihad, or jihadism. And this is not jihad in the noble sense that I believe in. I'm not going to take that away for a moment. Muslims from India that fought against the Nazis were fighting a valid jihad. So there is a whole range of arguments to be made about the importance of jihad. But this is the extreme form of vigilante jihadism. That's a third idea. A fourth idea is istishhad, or the yaqeen, or the certainty in that they're not murderers, but they're suicide bombers and they're martyrs. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, after 9/11, was extremely articulate in challenging this worldview that the suicide bombers are not martyrs but are murderers, and that's not something we've heard clearly enough. But this istishhad idea, backed by yaqeen and certainty, is another. And the fifth, perhaps more contentious, is again this belief of al-wala' wal-bara', that somehow Muslims must provide loyalty only to fellow Muslims of that takfiri variety, and disavowal or hatred for all other forms of not just Muslim behavior, but particularly non-Muslim, where bari'um minhum, that were disavowed from them. These are the 5 theopolitical ideas that underwrite, play the mood music for most suicide bombings. The Iraq war and everything else is a trigger, is a foreign policy trigger to justify this worldview, but essentially it's theopolitically underwritten. I'll end by saying that I'm sorry if it sounds like doom and gloom, but someone on the panel, I think, has responsibility to bring these issues out. And I will say that the good news is the rising trajectory among Muslims across the world is not to embrace these ideas. Even inside Saudi Arabia, even inside, most importantly, I think, Salafi organizations, these ideas are being challenged. So there is good news that it is happening, and much of this is happening without Western governments interfering. Thank you for listening.
I really would like to thank both the respondents and the 3 researchers for what have been excellent presentations. I found it myself absolutely gripping and very interesting indeed. And I just echo the comment that if we can lift the level of this discussion by this kind of informed consideration of what's happening, that's what we have to do. We've got almost half an hour left. I'm going to try and finish fairly promptly at 7. I'm going to take questions or comments in groups of 3. I'm going to request you to be as brief as you possibly can in your question or comment, because I want to get in as many people as I possibly can, and then I'll come to the panel for comments. We've got a number of people with mics who are going around, who I'm going to ask to come and identify themselves with you. So I'll start with the first 3. See the gentleman there, and these 2 at the front. Somebody's coming from just behind you. Ladies, just behind you. Could you just give your name and, if appropriate, organisation, please?
Hi there, my name is Mohammed. I'm a PhD student at the University of Exeter. I'm actually doing research in this area. Thank you for the panel for an interesting discussion. And I think one of the things we can take away from this is that there isn't one single cause towards radicalizations. You guys have identified multiple pathways. But one of the things I don't think anyone's touched upon or even addressed slightly is the consequences of taking that view. Now, the question I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to elaborate slightly to clarify.
I'm going to allow the question, but not the elaboration, if you appreciate it.
Right, could I just elaborate quickly, because the question won't make as much sense. Basically, the question is, what can we do to bridge the gap between the academic world and theories, such as the theories that Ed's posing, which is actually, we really need to go into it, like maybe afterwards, because I think I can deconstruct that in quite a lot of detail. So, the consequences of taking the multiple pathways is this: you don't actually have a criteria by which you can, in the world of policy, identify who the bad guys are. So you have such a wide net. So when it comes to prevent and counter terrorism, and it comes to something like the Channel Project, what the intelligence services have done is they've spread their net very wide, hoping to catch as many people as possible. They all happen to be Muslim, filter the process, and 99% of people will be all right, they're good, they're on our side, and it's just the 1% that they're concerned with. And my question is, what can we do to bridge the gap between the world of theory, the excellent research that the three of you have been talking about, and getting the policymakers? I think there's a big disjuncture.
I've got the point. Thank you very much. Second question, gentleman here.
Mohammed Amin, Vice Chairman of the Conservative Muslim Forum. The government's prevent strategy is quite clear about not engaging with non-violent extremists, but I think many people struggle, and I would like to invite the panel to offer their definition of those non-violent extremists that we should not engage with.
Thank you. And gentleman here.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Matthew Tarek Wilkinson from the Cambridge Muslim College. I was recently instructed as expert witness in Islamic theology in a big counter-terrorism trial. I would like to make two very brief points and then ask a question. My point to Professor Sedgwick is that in my experience, by addressing violence, we don't address the mechanisms that produce violence, and so addressing violence really will not, while it has to be the legal tipping point where we try and bring people to justice, it can never be the countering tipping point for addressing the issues at hand. And my issue would be with Mr. Hasan that although we may want to identify these sort of big picture global political drivers of it, there's undoubtedly the case that the complexion of radicalized violence is theopolitical. There can be absolutely no disputing that when you're actually at the coalface of people that are producing it and peddling it. So while we may want to identify these big global political mechanisms, surely we have to address the theology as well. And my third, is it a question, is it a point, is that if we are to address the violence, how do we address the violence? And if we are not, surely we have to look at curriculum in school, we have to look at all the processes that produce our young people and their minds.
Okay, I'm not going to ask everybody to respond, though I'll go first to the research and see who'd like to kick off in responding. Just to say, I should say myself in response to Mohammed, of course, this debate is actually one of the things which is designed to try and achieve a better dialogue between the academics and the practitioners. There are a number of people here in the gathering this evening from the security services, from the Home Office, and so on, who are actively involved in this question, and this is one of the contributions to this process. Yes.
Sorry.
Off you go, Matthew.
Yeah. And if I just might also add, of course, one of the other ways that we're trying to bridge that gap is through the website radicalizationresearch.org, which was set up precisely with that aim in mind, which was to help bring out excellent research coming out, developed by academics, to the attention of people, developing these policies. So that was one of these ways of trying to bridge that gap.
Mark?
Yeah. Two of the questions were quite similar. What do we do to bridge the gap, and how do we address the mechanisms? I think that one has to recognize that there's no magic bullet. And I think that what one has to do is to focus on real threats. Now, quite how one identifies a real threat is not my sphere. I mean, that's the security services who know about that. But identifying and focusing on real threats rather than hoping that there's a mechanism that one can interfere with. As far as the prevent strategy is concerned, I'd like to say that I myself think that the current prevent strategy is a vast improvement on the previous one. And it does, in some places, it makes a very useful distinction between extremism and radicalism and radicalization. Unfortunately, there are places where that distinction, even within the prevent strategy, begins to get lost. And the distinction is, I think, so fine that it's almost impossible to make it stick, that distinction, because the two, in practice, in people's understandings, tend to merge into each other.
Thank you.
Can I just say something, which is, Mark, I mean, that sounded a little bit vague, your first point, that it's not for you to look for the mechanisms, but in fact, you're just saying the security services know what to look for, aren't you?
Yeah.
And they are things like recruitment, go on, give some examples.
Yeah, well, I mean, particular travel patterns. I mean, there are some very obvious things, but it's particular travel patterns, visiting certain sorts of internet sites and things like this.
Okay. Marat, very quickly, and then I'm going to come to Mehdi and Ed.
Yes, I think we have some experience in this country in bridging the academic world and the world of theory with sort of practical issues. It's monitoring. You know, the Inform, for example, the information network focused on religious movements, does this work and does it very, very usefully. And their work is used by, general public and journalists and state agencies, government agencies. That's a very subtle work which can be used. And also I agree that we shouldn't really sort of wait until violence occurred. We should monitor the dynamics of movements before violence occurred. And there are many ways of doing this.
Thank you. Mehdi?
Let me deal with a couple of questions. One, Mohammed Amin's question about non-violent groups. I mean, this comes back to, again, my point earlier, which is where do you draw the net of non-violent extremists based on David Cameron's definitions? You're in slightly dodgy territory. Do not sit down with the Haredi Jews of North London as well as the Muslim Council of Britain. If bigoted views are the, if somebody has bigoted views and you don't engage with them, do not sit on a platform with the UK Independence Party. You can draw the line wherever you want, and it's very loose, and I wouldn't take that view where you don't sit down with non-violent groups. On Matthew's question, Matthew, I think your name is, question about theopolitical objectives. I mean, nice word, theopolitical, but I think it's just as elastic a phrase as extremist and radical. I mean, it sounds very nice, but I'm sure we can have a separate one-hour discussion on defining it. When you say there's no doubt this is theopolitical, well, as I say, well, A, what's theopolitical? And B, when you say no doubt on the coalface, well, I mentioned Mark Sageman, who's looked at 315 terrorist biographies. In his latest book, he looked at 2,100 terrorist biographies. He says he doesn't agree that they're theopolitical. You look at someone like Mark Sageman, the former CIA profiler who wrote Leaderless Jihad and Understanding Terror Networks. He says actually it's all about looking at the networks these people follow. It's not about religion. So we can argue about that. One thing I would agree with you. Sure, theology is important. I didn't say religion had no role. Of course, I would be mad to pretend the otherwise. Of course, it has a contributing factor, and of course, theology matters. But I slightly worry when you say we need to address the theology. Depends who we is. Certainly shouldn't be the government. I think the government shouldn't be deciding what is Islamically and isn't Islamically halal or haram. Yeah, well, I agree with that, of course, and I've written a lot on that before. Thank you. Ed?
I don't really have much to say on the question that was asked, so
Okay.
I have to.
Okay, next round of three. Gentleman with a white shirt there, guy in the blue here, guy on the gangway right in front. Just to say, I've so far picked 6 men and no women. I've been trying to look. So
You're an extremist, Charles.
I'm an extremist. And so I'm not going to be classified with David Cameron and Mohammed Karzai, but perhaps I'll keep my eyes especially open for women at the next round. Okay.
Hi there, my name is Richard Wilson. I'm the director of an interfaith charity, Interfaith Action. And I'd like to attack more the term theopolitical. I'd like to follow up on what Mary just said. Taking William Kavanagh, for instance, in The Myth of Religious Violence, he says that we don't actually know what religion is. We have no idea what religion is. So how are we trying to understand that religion can also be political? Because religion can be cultural factors, religion can be historical factors, religion can be tradition. Religion can just be the way in which you get up in the morning. And also, secondly, why are we seem to be also just looking at Islam and at the risk of being kind of ridiculously over politically correct. We need to take into account other faiths. We need to take into account that you know, we could equally talk about statism in the same way that you're saying. We could say that the state, separates other people from us. The state makes us want to provide loyalty to others in the same state. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman here.
I'd like to just challenge.
Could you just mention your name and?
My name's Joe Walsh. I'm an MA student at King's College.
Thank you, Joe.
I'd just like to challenge two assumptions that have been made, I think, by the panel. First, one I think that Mark made earlier about sacred space. I think you identified, as far as I'm correct, sacred space as the violation of sacred space as a demarcation of what can lead to violence in terms of the radicalization process. Now, in your view, can this work beyond purely radical groups? So, for instance, in my view, I suggest that sacred space is very much a social construct, and it's constructed by us as a liberal society as it is by radical groups. And certainly, in the past, we have justified violence in foreign policy terms based on what we have conceived as the violation of our sacred space. And both radical groups, if you want to call them that, and our society have done that at the same time. So that was the first of my two questions. Second, I wanted to ask, I may have completely forgotten, so never mind.
I'll ask afterwards in the drinks around. Gentleman there.
Yes, my name is Bjarne Nørum. I'm the UK correspondent for a Danish newspaper, Kristeligt Dagblad. And I want to actually get a feeling from you. What is your feeling? Do we see has the number of extreme terrorism peaked? Are we waiting for a new wave? Or where is it coming from? What's going to happen in the future?
Very exciting question. Ed, do you want to kick off on this round?
I mean, if I take the last question first, that's a very American question. As in, what's the future? And how can it be understood, predicted, and then contained, controlled, managed? The key countries that are worrying at the moment are Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan, the Sinai in Egypt, perhaps more for Israel than others. Those countries come immediately to mind. In terms of here in the UK domestically, there are people here from the Home Office and other parts of government who would most likely be able to answer that question better than I, so I won't go down that road. And then this question about religion and theology and what it means. Forgive me for saying so, but that's a very Church of England type mindset.
That's a vicious attack.
But with most Muslims, the borders and barriers of religion are broadly understood and.
Can I say, I'm sorry, I understand the point. Do follow it up with Ed afterwards, by all means, but there's a number of people trying to get in. I want to be relatively brief.
And I'll just finish very quickly by saying that our focus today is on Islamist extremism that leads to terrorism, and therefore the focus is on one religion. But I don't think those of us who speak about it have been shy in being critical of other religious forms of extremism, and Mehdi's been very vocal in being critical of Rick Santorum of late and getting much flack for that. But Rick Santorum's statement that where he comes from in the US they carry Bibles and guns with pride reminded me of Hamas people carrying Kalashnikovs and Qurans in public with pride. So there are similarities, but the bottom line is, and however distasteful this may be, the current trend of non-state actors that turn to violence predominantly comes from one religion, and hence the focus on a minority of adherents of that faith.
Thank you, Mehdi.
Just picking up on that last point, of course, we can argue about it all day long. I think the mass casualty spectaculars come from Muslim groups. I think if you look across the board in terms of law enforcement and crime, that's not necessarily true at all. If you look at the European Union, the majority of terrorist attacks in recent years have come from separatist and nationalist groups, if you look at the statistics. But anyway, I think the point that the gentleman makes is an interesting one about Islam. I've written about Jewish settlers engaging in acts of terror, Christian extremists. The point of pointing that out, and some Muslims go, oh look, we're not the terrorists, it's the Jews who are the terrorists. The point is not to say which religion is a terrorist religion. The point is to say the fact that everyone seems to do it suggests that religion is not the cause. God is a great excuse. I remember Richard Dawkins saying, I woke up on 9/11 and I knew this proved that religion is evil. No, it proves that people are capable of great acts of evil for all sorts of, as I say, worldly as well as next worldly reasons. Just very quickly on the point Ed makes about the future of terrorism, you mentioned Somalia, Pakistan, Yemen, etc. For me, there's one country that's going to turn it all around, that's Iran. If we go to war with Iran, you will have exactly what happened with Iraq, in that you will have a whole new generation of terrorists, radicals, extremists, both at home and abroad. And again, the cause will be geopolitical, not theopolitical.
Thank you. Marat?
Yes, I actually quite agree with you that it's impossible to separate religion and politics within kind of religious worldviews. Ed, in his Islamist says that Hizb ut-Tahrir saw all natural events as acts of God, yeah? Page 101. And at the same time, it has identifiable political goals. And we will get nowhere if we try kind of to prescribe what is politics and sort of separate religion and politics. As well as, this is why I disagree with you, or have rather reservations with Ed about what Ed said about sort of radical beliefs as potentially leading to violence, and we should kind of include it in our definition. Yes, radical beliefs can lead to violence, but radical beliefs is also, for many young people, is the only way to express their desire for change. They are, by definition, that's another definition of radical.
Thank you.
Being radical, trying to change something. So by sort of not addressing this issue, avoiding this issue, we will get nowhere. The real question is, how can we create a kind of public and social space to accommodate these radical beliefs?
Thank you, Marat. Matthew?
Thank you, yes. Just to respond to Joe's question, I certainly wasn't saying that sacred beliefs or sacred space must lead to violence, just that it can be a fruitful area to look at. And you mentioned also that, could this not happen within the secular sacred as well, for example? I gave the example of the defense of free speech given in the Rushdie affair. And certainly in those cases where people felt that free speech was a secular belief that should be defended, they didn't then follow that up with violent action. So it's not something that has to follow.
Thank you. Mark?
Theopolitics sounds as if it's something very unusual, but, in fact, you can find a theological element in all sorts of politics, and I think Tony Blair had a theological element in his politics.
He didn't do God. Thank you. Now, next round of three. The woman just there with the red dress, and I'm going to take two women right at the back. I can't quite see you under the lights. There's three of you, so if the three of you can sort out the two to ask the questions. Oh, you're just one question, okay. So the woman here first, then one question from that, then I'll come up.
My name is Chamila Lianaj. I'm a PhD student from University of London. There are two questions, very direct, I think. How do you explain the contextual factors like social polarization in relation to radicalization? And the second question, what is the role of community in preventing violent radicalization? Thank you.
Role of community, and then one question from three hands right at the back under the light.
Good evening. My name is Kate Cudahy. I'm Head of Citizenship at Graveney School in South London. One of the previous questions mentioned the curriculum in schools, and what we'd like to know is a very brief question actually, is what advice would you give to citizenship and religious studies teachers on challenging radical views from teenage students?
Thank you. The gentleman in the greenish shirt just here. Is there a mic around, please? Just this guy here. Thanks. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Daniel Nilsson Ahanas from Bristol University, and I'm really glad that Mehdi Hasan mentioned social networks and Mark Sageman's research in particular, because I think so far we've really privileged a very individual and atomistic sort of perspective in most presentations, I think. Which in a sense makes us privilege theological and rational sort of counter-radicalization approaches. So I was just wondering if people would agree that the movement to violence is a social process, and if that's the case, what implications does that have for countering that movement?
Okay, three interesting questions. I'm particularly interested in how you're going to answer the question of how you deal with teaching citizenship in schools. Mark, do you want to kick off?
Gosh, okay, fine. Well, I think that's a very interesting question too. I would say that you probably handle radical views or what appears to be radical views in the same way as a teacher handles any other view that they disagree with. That's to say, a view which hasn't had its premises properly examined, which may be based on false information, misunderstandings, etc. So, I mean, if somebody thinks that the that in 1066 the French invaded England, for example, you know, what one does with that and what one does with any other thing. I don't think that there's really a great difference.
Thank you. Matthew? Anything you want to say?
Yes, just about the idea that radicalisation, and perhaps we've treated it as quite an atomised process, and certainly when you're condensing a lot of research into a short presentation, it's difficult to catch everything. Certainly I would agree that radicalisation, or no, not radicalisation, that a move to violence, as you talked about it, is a social process and does take place in where ideas can be reinforced by each other, and certainly my own research has borne that out. In terms of advice to religious studies teachers, I'd be chary of giving advice, but I would say that there is a need for greater religious literacy amongst pupils, both at school level, and also other research that I've done with the religious literacy program has also shown that we could do with greater religious literacy amongst university students as well, and so that's something that we could promote to help that.
Okay, Marat?
Yeah, two brief points concerning the curriculum. Let me add one word: empathy. We actually need, strangely enough, to understand why people hold these beliefs, because we're talking too much about beliefs. We don't talk sufficiently about the individuals and why they hold this belief, the affinity, why particular beliefs have affinity with particular people in particular circumstances. To understand that and discuss it with people, we need empathy, as well as knowledge. And the social networks, yes, they are important actually. If I may advocate this sort of article, it analyzes in detail how internal dynamics within the group and dynamics within the group and other groups within the region actually produced these dynamics of violence. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's crucial.
Thank you. Ed, do you want to respond to any of those questions?
Only the role of communities, if I may.
Yes, I'm glad somebody's going to take it.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the British Muslim communities, first and foremost, are on a journey. There's a generational dimension here, that the first generation that came here built most of the mosques, still is on most mosque committees. Second and third generation now aspiring to that level of leadership. But that said, credit's got to be given where it's due, and that is the vast majority of British Muslim mosques and community leaders have repeatedly expelled extremists from their mosques. There's no doubt about that. Go into any mosque and just try that rhetoric in public and you will be expelled by the leaders of most mosques. So where has most of the extremism, terrorism appeared? It's been on university campuses. But I'd say two things here, and that is one, tip-offs from Muslim community leaders have helped the authorities tamp down on terrorism and extremism. And secondly, organizations such as the Radical Middle Way, for whom Abdurrahman Malik is here today, have done fabulous work in taking mainstream Muslim community voices that ordinarily don't get exposure to grassroots level out into the country, and so have others actually. But my main important point here is that Muslim communities are on a journey, and to be fair to the Muslim Council of Britain, they've played an important role in fostering a dimension of argument which leads to pluralism and acceptance of all forms of Islam within the UK, rather than playing the sectarian card.
Thank you very much. And Mehdi?
Can I just make
1 second, I'm going to take Mehdi, then I'll give you one very quick comment.
Well, I agree with a lot of what Ed just said. I think that's very important, what he said. Also, on the community question, very important point. When we talk about Muslim communities dealing with extremism and radicalisation, it's not just about having a theological debate in a mosque about which verses of the Quran justify jihad or not. It's actually about basic things which apply to non-Muslims, much Muslim, which is things like parenting, things like neighbourliness, things like understanding where your children are and what they're doing. I mean, but slightly basic things when it comes to dealing with vulnerable children, regardless of what kind of radicalisation, religious or otherwise. On the point about social networks, I mean, I find the stuff, Marat Shterin stuff fascinating. I think it's very important, and it's important because you've got security services, we talked about earlier, how do you identify people, looking in the wrong places. If you assume, as in the United States for a long period, that mosques were the hotbeds of terrorism, which they're not, as Ed's pointed out both in Britain and America, and the empirical evidence shows that, and you're looking in the wrong place when actually it's groups of young men who are coming together through kinship or friendship or bonding. And those of you who haven't seen Chris Morris's film 4 Lions, I think it should be compulsory viewing for anybody working in the counterintelligence, counter-extremism field. In particular, the scene where the police turn up at the house of his brother, the big bearded Salafi, to arrest him, rather than the irreligious younger brother who's actually plotting the terror attack.
Great. Very quickly, Marat.
Very quickly. In response to Ed, actually it's interesting that the latest report by the Committee of the House of Commons didn't find any hard evidence that prisons and university campuses are sides of violent radicalization. I mean, violent radicalization leading to violence. There is plenty of evidence that probably sides of radicalization, but not violent. It's a huge difference because it would probably trigger an entirely different way of thinking about how to deal with that.
Okay, I'm going to take the final group of three, and I'm going to favour women, given my poor record so far. You definitely don't look... Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Yes, yes, you are. There. No, you're not. Yes, you are. That lady there. No, okay. I thought the lady next to you might be indicating. Okay, I've failed on that aspect of discrimination. So I'll take the gentleman there, 1, the gentleman there, 2, and a final one, the gentleman over there, 3.
Yeah, Mark. Does it work? Marcus Feder. We've looked at a lot at the question what leads to radicalization, but not really at the other question, what leads to de-radicalization. And we've seen a number of terrorist movements around in the world. For instance, I'm German, so I've seen the Baader-Meinhof group in Germany, which had a huge amount of support, particularly amongst young people. But then there came a move to de-radicalization. A lot of Baader-Meinhof terrorists were locked up, but that was not the reason why the support dropped for Baader-Meinhof. A simple factor was simply money. It sounds very profane, but people made money, had a family, had other interests, and were no longer interested in the aims of Baader-Meinhof. What are the key factors which have led people who were prone to it, could have become a terrorist, to de-radicalize? Has any research been done on that?
Thank you. Gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Usman. I'm a Faith Sex Fellow at the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. My question is particularly to Ed on universities. I graduated last year from university in law at Hull. I served as vice president of the Islamic Society there as well for a year. I did see signs of radicalization at the campus, and I'm hearing now reports that it has got a lot worse. So, I mean, I find it strange when select committees say that it doesn't exist or universities aren't problematic in that sense when we're hearing from the Home Secretary and the Deputy Prime Minister about FOSIS and organisations like that which are problematic, giving speakers platforms to speakers which are not only controversial but sometimes encouraging students to think not outside the box but in dangerous methods, I think. So, I mean, what would you say about building on the capacity of Islamic societies to do what they are meant to do, providing a space for not only Muslims but also others as somebody somewhere away from home and giving them support whilst in another place?
Very clear. And the final question is the gentleman there, yes.
From the Coexist Foundation. It's been an interesting discussion, but I'm slightly troubled that we spent £12 million and we're still defining the exam question, but I look forward to the findings of the next £12 million.
That's the academy for you.
My question picks up Marek's point about empathy and the extent to which the panel think it's possible to empathize with the mindset of murderers, if you like. And I want to put Mehdi on the spot and say that were he in his glittering career to empathize with the mindset of the MI5 officer who's trying to tackle this challenge, where do you look, given that Ed says, and he's right, that by the time it's violent, it's too late?
Okay. Now, I'm going to take final responses from the panel. I'm just going to go along the line. I know, Matthew, you had a point you wanted to get in on the earlier one, so when I come to you, feel free to make that other comment. Marat first.
Yes, obviously the kind of most challenging question, how can we empathize with murderers? I think you are making a link which I didn't make. I didn't say that we should empathize with murderers. We should empathize with radical people who hold radical views, which is a whole world of difference. You know, and if you make the assumption that all people who hold radical views inevitably end up being murderers, it's a very dangerous, I would say, way of thinking. Then we can't actually de-radicalize anyone. Or provide a kind of public space for what you might call de-radicalization. But probably, I mean, this is a sociologist speaking, we can even empathize with murderers if we want to understand them. Not with murder, but why people do what they do. And empathize doesn't mean sympathize or condone what they do, understand. And that's what we all should try and do. What leads to de-radicalization? There are a lot of things which lead to de-radicalization, which is not even which doesn't come from kind of deliberate actions or organizational arrangements, if you like. For example, people grow older. I've met quite a lot of people recently who feature in, again, Ed's book, Islamist, and they're quite different people now. Okay. And part of it that, you know, they've got families now and so on. Society changes, and all sorts of other things, which obviously I don't have the time to talk about.
Thank you, Marat. Matthew.
Thank you. Yes, I was very glad that Marat mentioned about the report suggesting that there is very little evidence for, or not so much evidence for radicalisation taking place on university campuses, and the question was brought up again as well. I've done research on university campuses as well, and I have come across people working in Islamic societies who said, yes, we've had some people who've come on into the campus and tried to put forward certain ideas which we have found unacceptable, and they have self-regulated that. And I think it's very dangerous to start saying that we should be prescribing to Islamic societies what they're there for and who they should support and in what way. That's not beneficial for reasons that the Marat outlined in his paper earlier on. But also that the current approach informed by this idea that universities are hotbeds of radicalisation has been unhelpful. So, I have attended a RAP presentation from the local police about how we could help identify vulnerable people on campus. And as one participant took it afterwards, he said it was like going to sort of a very basic sociology lesson where the teacher had no idea what they were talking about. He said, I don't know if I'm looking for rich people, undereducated people, overeducated people with mental health disabilities. I've got this list as long as my arm. And then she also said we should look out for people, groups where somebody's standing at the front talking to groups of people. On a university. So where clear patterns haven't been identified, this is clearly not helpful. And I would say that if there were such clear patterns of radicalisation taking place, I'm sure that the huge amount of money that's been spent on these projects would be able to give clearer guidance to universities to tackle it. Ed mentioned earlier on just about sort of, the fact that we shouldn't allow these ideas to continue just because they are, just because we should, want this discourse to continue. I mean, he mentioned that, for example, we challenge sexist language and sexist views, for example. And we do, and it's right that we should challenge these views, but that doesn't mean that we should prescribe or that we should sort of criminalise people to do that. Andy Gray isn't in prison right now, but everybody challenged, some of the opinions that he made that were unacceptable. So there's a difference between not challenging and then prescribing them.
Thank you. Mark.
Yeah, I mean, in my research, I spent quite a lot of time trying to empathise with very often dead terrorists from hundreds of years ago. But I'm going to accept the challenge of trying to empathise with a security officer. And I think that what I would want to do in that case is to focus on what we know rather than on what we would like to know or wish we knew. That's to say, to focus on individuals, to focus on actions, perhaps to focus on specific social networks, not to focus on milieus, not to focus on very large groups, and not to focus, not to base action on processes that we do not know exist, and which probably don't exist.
Thank you. Mehdi.
I think it's a very good question the gentleman asked at the back there. I'm not a security services officer, so I'm not expert to answer. I think what's interesting was Matthew's answer there about throwing the net. What I wouldn't do, I can tell you what I wouldn't do first, if I don't mind, is throw that net so wide where you're going around looking at, there's that famous case during the Prevent a couple of years ago about the child in Birmingham who was referred to local police because they thought a 6-year-old child or a 7-year-old child was vulnerable to radicalisation. I think you've got to kind of focus your limited resources in the age of austerity and focus on intelligence-led, the phrase intelligence-led policing, rather than profiling. I mean, that's the danger. That's the Americanism which goes down a kind of a terrorist profile, is the worst thing to do. Both it's self-defeating and it allows people who are not in the profile to easily beat you. You mentioned MI5. There was a 2008 study by MI5's Behavioural Science Unit which emphasised that the several hundred terrorists it analysed, quote, had taken strikingly different journeys to violent extremist activities. Few had followed, quote, a typical pathway to violent extremism. So I definitely feel empathy. I'm frustrated, and that's why events like this are so important, presentations like this are so important, because we don't know. We don't have an easy, simple profile, and that makes life so hard for our security services. But the answer then is not then to adopt a lazy profile in order to cut some corners.
Thank you. Ed.
If I just take the question on de-radicalization, I think several things. One, there is no clear black and white de-radicalization model that works. Different countries and different communities have adopted different ways of doing it and have had different results. In Saudi Arabia, for example, they not only give you a second wife, but also a Toyota, which has to be a white Toyota Corolla. Now, clearly here in the UK and in other countries, that's not an option. But that said, there is good work going on in some prisons. Saudi Arabia happens to be one, Egypt another, where Libya too, for Gaddafi and all of his faults, one of the things he successfully did, or his son safe, was to disengage from violence, not necessarily de-radicalize, but there's a difference, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. But 3 or 4 things seem to be the general trend, having added those caveats. One is age, just simply growing up and realizing that there's more to life than just going around uttering bizarre statements and expecting others to do so and take things to the logical conclusion. Second is the injection of doubt. One of the things I found most instructive is when I was in Syria and Saudi Arabia and meeting people who were of the extreme Salafi wing here in the UK, but once they reached Syria and Saudi Arabia, they met Muslim scholars who were rooted in Muslim history and theology, but looked at the world in different terms. Having that argument put to them and therefore injecting doubt in their certainty helped over time nourish those minds to be far more de-radicalized. Without sounding too extensive, I'd throw one more in, and that's women. Falling in love, getting married, and everything that follows has had a positive impact, not just on younger radicals that I knew growing up, who are now more or less family men and with other responsibilities, but also the Israelis have used that with Hamas. Some of the more extreme Hamas members have been facilitated with marriage and whatever else, and that seems to have taken out a certain sting.
It didn't help Bin Laden.
I did say it doesn't apply with everyone.
Different version of arranged marriage. I think we've had a tremendous session. I'm sorry we've run over. I failed to keep it in time as I had intended. I particularly want to appreciate the panel. I think that we've had some excellent research, very clearly presented. And we've had from Mehdi and Ed some extremely informed and careful responses, which I really think do help the discussion. We've had a bit of controversy, which I very much welcome. This area needs controversy and discussion. But the most important thing is that we have these debates on a basis of information and understanding of what's going on, rather than on the basis of prejudices and polemic. And I think this whole event has helped that happen in a very important way. Particularly thanks, Linda, to you and your research programme for making this possible. And thanks finally to all of you for coming this evening and giving us your time. We've got some drinks at the end to circulate amongst yourselves and to talk to members of the panel. I hope you come to the future events. The next is a fortnight tonight, talking about the role of welfare, and the 2 respondents are David Blunkett and Archbishop Peter from the Archbishop of Southwark. I think that these series are designed to promote discussion of this type, which is extremely important. Thank you again for coming. Thank you.